It's called the nature island of the Caribbean, indeed of the world. Like many other Caribbean countries, it's got its own handle. We'll find out more about how Dominicans go about the search for Eden in their country. Up next, we'll look in the book, In Search of Eden, by Gabriel Christian and Irving W. Stay tuned.
Hi, I am TC, a soca artist from Barbados, and I am a strong woman. I believe, my brothers and sisters, that it's time for us to unite to end violence against women.
Hello, welcome to Carib Nation. I'm Pristine. Today we have another son of the Caribbean who has decided to write his own history. We've heard a lot of Dominica, and very often it is mistaken with its larger neighbor, the Dominican Republic. One is called Dominica, the other one is called the Dominican Republic. We must make that distinction. Dominica is known as the nature island of the Caribbean, indeed of the world, for its lush vegetation and many waters. But many people across the Caribbean, as has always been the case, do not know very clearly all of the history of many of these islands. Gabriel Christian and his friend, Irving W, have decided to write a book chronicling the events that make up the history of Dominica. I spoke with Gabriel about 3 years ago when he wrote In Search of Eden Part 1, and he brought us from Columbus to the 60s. Today he's with us to talk about the second half of that history, from the 70s to the present. Gabriel, thanks for joining us, and welcome to Carib Nation.
Well, thank you, Doris. Thank you for making this opportunity available to not me, really, but to our people, frankly, so we can get a good sense of where we are now, considering where we've been, and hopefully outline an approach as to where it is we're going.
Mm-hmm. Well, I wonder, having completed the first half of the history, knowing you, I'm sure you felt it had to be completed. You had to get the other half done. But do you think that in that time, since you wrote the first half, that Caribbean people are now more ready to stand on their own 2 feet and to stand up and be counted in this era of globalization?
We're not where we want to be, and we're not where the visionary leaders we've had, like Michael Manley, Eric Williams, Errol Barrow, Marcus Garvey, certainly, Bob Marley in his own way, really wanted us to be, but we are getting there. You know, I always tell people, never wax pessimistic, always wax optimistic. You know, the glass is half full, you know, not half empty. Reality is, Doris, and I just want to pay tribute in that context to my brother by choice, the co-author, Irving W. Interestingly, I just would like the listeners to know that the very same week this book came out, he got a call from the Attorney General of Ontario. He is now the youngest justice of the Superior Court in Ontario, Canada, black or white. He's now the Right Honourable Justice, Irving W, who went to the University of the West Indies, went on to Johns Hopkins University History, became an attorney in Canada, a very successful one at that, but decided to be dutiful to the community from which he came. You know, he came from the breast of Dominica. He was nurtured at its root, and he did not allow a nice suburban lifestyle in Canada to take him away, to cloud his vision and have him forget his obligations. And likewise, I'd like to think that he inspired me earlier in '92 when we did the first book, and now 10 years later when we did the second edition, to lay out you know, the entrails, if I want to call it that, if I may call it that, of Dominican, i.e. Caribbean society, because Dominica is no more than a let's say, outline of the wider region. Some of the problems are the same, most of the problems are the same in each island. And propose some solutions to issues of foreign exchange, income, education, science and technology, governance, environmental protection, and our rights as free people of African, Carib, and European descent to forge a new path born of independence and dignity, which I think is our right as a people.
Talking about independence, many people still question whether the Caribbean is truly independent when we look at what is happening today. We still seem to be attached to the purse strings of the larger mother countries, so to speak. And Caribbean unity has been addressed in here to some extent. And we look at how ready these countries have to be for unity. But first they must be ready for themselves.
That's correct.
They must have that strength within themselves, have their people understand their history well enough to have that confidence and pride in their history.
That's right.
Before they can come together.
That's right.
Is that on the way?
Doris, you know, I guess as human beings we cannot but compare. And when one understands that the Caribbean was not designed when it was colonized by Columbus and the indigenous Arawaks and the indigenous Caribs were massacred and Africans were kidnapped and brought in to build a sugar industry, which was the instigator, as Dr. Eric Williams talks about in Capitalism and Slavery, for the Industrial Revolution, the same Industrial Revolution that made the West great. These islands were not designed to be independent ever. And the mere fact that we've been able to hold it together for going on now 40 years is a testimony to our resilience. Remember, it's in the same 40-year period that we've seen brutal wars in the Middle East, some maybe impending. We've seen the breakup of Yugoslavia, devastation in the former Soviet Union, terrible problems in Africa where people have much more resources than we have. And here we are in these tiny countries, despite all limitations of geography, despite all limitations of resources, we have been able to navigate a sense of independence. And when you look at the Caribbean as a whole, and I speak as an English Caribbean person, we have some of the best indices in education, in health, than in many countries all over the world. We have a lot of problems, but we are in fact exhibiting, I believe, a indomitability of spirit that can carry us through. And so the question is, what is going to be required? I say to people, why do we know about the Egyptians? Because they wrote on their walls the hieroglyphics that have now been deciphered. Why do we know about the Greeks? Because they kept a written record on the Grecian urn, and so we know about them. Why do we know about the Romans? And so on and on and on. So I believe, first of all, introspection and a conceptualization of self that says dignity, that says can do, that says I'm able, that says I'm competent, is a prerequisite. And we've done that in a multitude of ways. We've done that by producing the likes of leaders like Michael Manley and Morris Bishop and Rosie Douglas, who I talked about. Fidel Castro's name falls in there too, because he represents, whether you like him or not, a very, very, important figure on the world stage. We had the first slave revolt in history in Haiti in the early 18th century with Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines and Christophe. So we have a legion in the political governability area of folk who stood up. We also, on the cultural side, have brought an enormous degree of talent to the world stage. You know, the Mighty Sparrow, the Steel Pan in Trinidad, Bob Marley, Calypso from Dominica, Gramax Exile 1. We are not, you know, we're not wilting daisies in the Caribbean. We are very welcoming. We represent a very cosmopolitan and interesting cross-section of world civilization. That we are still here says to me that we have a good opportunity to make it.
To consider the glass half full.
That's right. That's right.
Let's go back over a little bit of the history as we come up to the 70s. One of the things that many people might have forgotten was the threat of the Ku Klux Klan, the threat of invasion by the Ku Klux Klan in Dominican history. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what that has meant and how has that impacted on the psyche of the people today.
Well, you know, the entire Ku Klux Klan episode, which involved actually David Duke, the so-called presidential candidate at one point in this country, represented one side of a coin. The other side was an indefatigable spirit to maintain our independence. The other side was a squalid betrayal of the best hopes of a leader by the name of Patrick John, who was our first independence leader, someone who we had supported. Essentially, we have to look at the historical context. What happened in 1975 was the Portuguese Empire in Africa collapsed. Under Amilcar Cabral, the folks in Guinea-Bissau threw out the Portuguese. Under Samora Machel in Mozambique, they threw out the Portuguese. And under Agostinho Neto, the Angolan people threw out the Portuguese. There were some people in the world, powerful and rich, who were after Angolan oil and resources, who supported a gentleman who lost his life not too long ago called Jonas Savimbi. And together with the South Africans, he came together with them in that pernicious exercise to frustrate Angolan independence and invaded Angola. No less a person than Fidel Castro, with the help of Michael Manley and Michael Manley of Jamaica, Errol Barrow of Barbados, and Forbes Burnham of Guyana, came together and facilitated Cuban assistance to the Angolans to frustrate the invasion, and the Cubans fought the South African invaders to a standstill in the battle first at Quifangondo in northern Angola, and later at the Battle of Quito in southern Angola, and they drove them back. The Angolans were victorious, the South Africans were furious. They, with the Bureau of State Security, hatched a pernicious plan with the American Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan to get back at the Cubans. And how they were going to do it was to use Dominica as a base to do two things: to try to launch a new attack against the Cubans, using Dominica as a base, because as you know, Dominica is in the central portion of the Caribbean, and they would have their friends in Miami and elsewhere assist them. And to do that, they wanted a full half of Dominica as a free port. And I was in school at the time. When we found out the plan, we protested. That plan went down, and the government was removed shortly thereafter. The gentleman who was involved as Prime Minister, Patrick John, decided then to proceed with a private enterprise invasion, signed a contract with the Klan. In his mind, perhaps he thought he would have used them to get back into power because he'd been thrown out. But of course, they had their own plans to use him. Thanks be to God, frankly, and the daring of a Dominican Rastafarian, black nationalist by the name of R.G. Matthey, Rosie Douglas. They found out about the plan, advised the government then of Eugenia Charles, who was a U.S. ally, and the plan was frustrated, and we were able to retain our independence. But it just showed us how prized it is we are as a region. We represent some of the most significant real estate. We're small islands, but we represent significant geostrategic position. We're nice islands in general. And sometimes people will try to use our location, use our geography, use our resources to get to their own objectives. But we can thwart that if we stand together.
Precisely.
We can thwart that.
Talking about Rosie Douglas, before we get too close to the end, I know we cannot get through this without talking about Rosie Douglas. And we all know that Rosie, again, came up through the Black Power movement and made it to the position of Prime Minister of Dominica, and fate took him away too early. Talk about where you think Dominica would be today had Rosie Douglas lived.
Further ahead, most likely, because Rosie Douglas represented a rare breed, and that's why he was taken away from us. There are some of us who have questions about his death, as with Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and all the great and legendary black nationalists and Pan-Africanists and heroes. We don't know what it is. History will teach us about that, but he is no longer with us, but his legacy remains. His legacy was that of friendship among peoples, black and white. His first mission upon gaining office was to come to New Orleans, by the way, the same city from which the invasion of the Ku Klux Klan was supposed to come from. And he initiated a protocol with that distinguished university, the University of New Orleans, and its very distinguished chancellor, Gregory O'Brien, to train Dominicans in hotel and tourism management, to create a new tourism product based on our natural environment. As you know, Dominica, if you may look at this book, I don't know which way the camera is, but
of course.
Dominica, the nature island, I mean, we are beautiful. The entire Caribbean is beautiful, but of course Dominica has some extra gloss, of course.
Of course.
And so he was about education. He was about using education as a tool to empower people. He was about acquiring the latest in technology. He was about linking Dominicans and Caribbean people with North American African Americans and Afro-Canadians, because he'd gone to McGill, he'd gone to Sir George in the 60s.
That's right.
He'd been a leader in North America. He'd been a leader in Africa. So he was possessed of the rare background of coming from a upper middle class Caribbean background, having gone to some of the best schools in North America, now Prime Minister, linking African Americans, Afro-Caribbean people, folks on the continent. No longer, you know, a triangle of slavery, but a triangle of freedom. So we could exchange and use our skills and everything else. He was supposed to deliver a speech at the Million Family March on the 16th. He died on the 1st. There's some who believe he was not supposed to give that speech. So the reality is, I think we would have been further ahead, not just as Dominicans, but as Caribbean people, because what he wanted us to do was to stop thinking within the box that colonialism had confined us to, and begin to think outside the box, and to begin to understand that together we do better, that we cannot get to where we need to if we remain little kings in our little kingdoms or little fiefdoms. Jamaica over there and Barbados over there and Cuba over here and so forth. But if we can use CARICOM as a platform to build functional unity, there's much that we have to teach the world. And so his legacy is a proud one, and I'm happy to have been you know, nurtured in a great many ways by him, and in the way the book we did is in tribute to his legacy of independence, of education for people, and for opportunity.
And that's why I didn't want to get through without talking about him. Before we close, I will ask you to read a passage from the section on his outreach 2000, because I think that would be a fitting point on which to end. But before we get to that, migration, which is still relevant today, is one of the things that I'd like to talk about, simply because the Caribbean has seen what we often call the brain drain. There are those who feel that it is probably better to have those people leave a country that cannot afford to pay them and depend on the remittances that they send back, where they can do better in another country, than have them leave the country, than have them stay in the country, where they will spiral down into poverty simply because the resources are not there to give them the education and the employment that they require for a better standard of living. And Irving Andre has documented extensively in here the history of migration. Comment on that a little bit and bring us from there to now, and talk about how if there is a change, and if there's a lot of similarities still, and where are we heading there?
I believe we're heading to a greater understanding, if God's grace be upon us, and I hope it is, to the importance of the Caribbean diaspora. We are a transplanted people for the most part, with the blood of Europe, Africa, and the indigenous people running in our veins. We are proud and virile people. And it is true that many of us left, like Mr. Hilton, my brother who wrote the book on religion in the Caribbean, to come to the United States, Canada, England, to get a better education, to improve our economic lot, and the like. But what I believe among policymakers in the Caribbean and Caribbean leaders, there's an increasing realization of, as Irving Andre mentions in our book, is of the wealth, the treasure trove of knowledge, of technological know-how, of financial wherewithal that the diaspora brings to the table. Right now, there are many Caribbean nations which would have frankly imploded had there not been the infusion, the steady infusion over the years of technique, of know-how, of funds, of finance, to really keep things going. And what we have to do now is to move it from the level of the whimsical or the ad hoc, or the, you know, one family sending a barrel to one family, to the level of getting together to build energy companies. Institutionalization, that's correct. of that process. And I believe now that in certain islands, I believe Jamaica is an example, they have representation in government or office of overseas Jamaicans, I believe it's called. In Dominica, we're pushing through the Brooklyn Declaration, because we've had several things happen. I'll just mention, when Douglas died, we founded the Rosie Douglas Foundation. Yeah. There's now a Dominican Academy of Arts and Sciences. There's now the World Wide Web. We can use the web to humor ourselves and use it for idle chit-chat, or we can use it as a tool for liberation. And what we've done is we've used that web platform to create the Dominican Academy of Arts and Sciences. For those who are listening, it's at www.da-academy.org. And we're hoping in time to have an overarching Caribbean Academy of Arts and Sciences. We've now got 300 or so artists and scientists of the highest caliber, including a Dominican who helped develop the first Intel chip. He's a doctor of physics out in Seattle. The reality is, if Dominica, which has about 80,000 or so people on island, and maybe 100,000 overseas, can have such talent, can you imagine what Jamaica has?
Of course.
Barbados, Guyana, and if we can all get that in one place with a critical mass, can you imagine what we can do with that? We know what we can do with that because we've seen the Koreans do it. We've seen the Jews do it for Israel, and the Chinese do it for China. And so too, I believe we have an opportunity as a people to use our talents. A lot of the people who are in the diaspora will never go home. They will maybe go home to only visit or go home to retire. So we have to realize that and try to use people where they are, because in today's world, with the information highway, with money transfers, you don't have to pack your bags and return, but you can, your presence can be felt in a multitude of ways. The hospital you support, the school that you that you send resources to, a student who you mentor, and the technology that you transfer, as we are doing now in Dominica with the Dominica Sustainable Energy Corporation, DSEC. Bought a wind turbine in Oklahoma. It's the most advanced wind turbine in the Eastern Caribbean. We're now producing electricity from the wind.
With all that water that you have there, wind and water.
Wind and water. So, you know, God has given us a natural bounty. Now we just have to put our talents to work to make it happen. And I believe the diaspora is going to be the key to unlocking us from some of our potential, which has been imprisoned for so long.
That's true. Give us 30 seconds from this. Let us see what we can... At least let's read a little bit of that. So that chronicles, that talks about Rosie's outreach in 2000, which I think will carry on.
Yes, Rosie's a very humorous person. And he says in a meeting, standing room only, 3,000 Dominicans up in Brooklyn, quote, "I know many of you visit home at Carnival, Easter, and Christmas. You're wearing your nice dandan, looking sweet. In your bags, you make sure you have some gifts. Cheap ones you bought before. When you reach home, you're eager for that boudin and ginger beer and sorrel. You're having a good time. But sometimes you forget to see how the country is doing and what you can do to make it better." Rosie Douglas, 2000, May, Brooklyn, New York.
And that is what the diaspora needs to take on as its mantle, its challenge.
That's right.
To see the Caribbean through globalization, which many people still consider a new form of colonialism.
That's right.
Last few minutes before we go, your inspiration. I know that your family plays a very strong role in your search for history. Talk a little bit about your family, your parents, and what brought you to this point.
Well, you can only, you know, put a key into a lock to open the door if the lock is there, if there's a hole there in the first place. My parents created the initial intellectual opening. My mother, God bless her, is still here. She's 76, worked with the blind, had a social consciousness, was about education. My father, 81, God bless his soul, still with us, British Army, police officer, senior fire officer on the island, someone who always read, could tell me about Winston Churchill and his famous speeches, and tell me about his time during World War II, and the Battle of Normandy, and the Battle of, you know, the withdrawal at Dunkirk. So there's that thirst for knowledge that was ignited in me from a very young age, and I give grace to God for having given me the parents. And of course, we always, it wasn't always easy. I mean, in the 1970s, during the student movement for independence and the Black Power movement and so on, when Rosie Douglas would come by my house when I was younger, it was testy, you know.
I'm sure they must have regretted that they really piqued that interest then.
Right.
Thought, what would we lead this child into?
That's right. They thought this guy was going to get away, you know, and go into the hills and do something stupid. But the reality is, they provided a very nurturing intellectual environment that people like Rosie Douglas and others, I think, just added onto. And they provided a home where discussion around the dinner table was vast in the spectrum it covered. I mean, I remember my dad and I in 1968 speaking about the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and my father thinking it was lead to war. And you know, the only question I asked, I said, Daddy, what do you think? We won't be able to get any more rice? Because rice was important. I thought if there was war, you know. They always told me during the World War II they couldn't get imports. And I thought we were going to have to go back to those days, you know. Yeah. So intellectual curiosity, appreciation for education, for knowledge, something we have to always keep our children very keenly aware of, is something they inspired me with. And I thank God for Alberta Christian and Wendell Christian, my beloved parents, who made a way. Because I think they represent the quintessential Caribbean parent. Because, you know, in our culture, education is very, very strong. Yes. We never got 40 acres in the mule. I don't even think we ever asked for it. We never got any compensation after emancipation was declared in 1834. But we saw education, or people did, certainly saw education as a tool to empowerment. And we have a concern here, some of us in the community, as with Mr. Hilton, Curtis Ward, Leo Edwards, the giants of our community here in the Washington area, that our second, third, and fourth generation do not lose that vision.
Right.
And we
keep that connection.
We're going to have to work hard. Some of the happiest days I have is when I go to the school system in Prince George's County, where I live and work, to do that mentoring and to have that relationship with the school system. And that's something, that's one of the nicest part, I think, of my practice of giving back to the community, which gave me. Not only the community in Dominica from where I came, or the Caribbean from where I came, but the community here, the African-American community, and the wider community here, which has nurtured my development.
To this point, yeah.
To make sure I give back. And that, the J. Franklin Bourne is a bar association named after famous African-American judge J. Franklin Bourne, Prince George's County, does some of that work also.
Okay, well, the book is called In Search of Eden. It's the second edition, Essays on Dominican History. It's, as you see, quite an extensive read, but very interesting, a lot to learn. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Lars. God bless you.
And thanks to you for joining us on Carib Nation. Until next time.